ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first addendum to the Su-25 and Su-25T Cadet series. The addendums are simply things I forgot or that I for some reason left out. This first addendum is about fuel meter and fuel tanks and how to jettison your weapons and your fuel tanks. If you take a look at our fuel meter, right now in number 1 up here and number 2 here are not lit up, they are dark. That means that I have mounted fuel tanks and the fuel tanks have fuel in them. As we can see, a total amount of fuel is roughly 6,200 kilograms. Let's say that they are empty, light number 1 come on and light number 2 come on. When light number 1 comes on, that means that the outermost fuel tanks are empty. When light number 2 comes on, it means that the innermost fuel tanks are empty. There are two ways of dropping your fuel tanks. If you keep your fuel tanks on until all of them are empty, you can use the jettison fuel tanks button. When you press that button, all of your fuel tanks will drop immediately. And let's get one thing clear. Some air forces call them drop tanks, some air forces call them external fuel tanks, some air forces may call them something very different. Just because the Russian Air Force or Russian Aerospace Forces calls them something, or the US Air Force call them something, does not mean that that is the only thing they are called them, and that is the only correct answer. It is just like afterburner, reheat or post-heat. All of those are technically correct, so therefore it does not matter if you call them external fuel tanks or drop tanks. We all know what they are. I may call them fuel tanks, I may call them external fuel tanks, I may call them drop tanks. I'm sure that you are intelligent enough to know what I mean. Therefore, I will not mention that anymore. One thing about Russian fuel tanks, Soviet/Russian fuel tanks, is that if you see on the fuel tanks, there are those little fins. Those fins are there for a reason, and those fins has an angle downwards for a reason. It is simply because when you drop the fuel tanks, to prevent the fuel tanks from flipping over and going over your wing and creating massive damage, sorry, that fin helps for the fuel tanks to fall nose down first. Therefore it will not flip over, and the aerodynamic on the rear of the fuel tanks also has some fins that prevent the fuel tanks from making a I don't know, from spinning around. The Danish word is koldbøtte, but yeah, it prevents them from spinning around and hitting the wing from the underside. Therefore, they are there for a reason, and not because they are bombs or whatever you want to call them. Barrel bombs. Jokes aside, if your fuel tanks are completely empty, or if you are entering a combat area, because it is standard operating procedures to drop your fuel tanks when you enter a combat area, for the sole reason that If your fuel tank get hit, they may explode, they may cover the entire fuselage in jet fuel, or any other sort of thing. Therefore, you drop them before you enter combat area or in a dogfight to be as light as possible. So, when we just cross this ridge, for that you need button jettison fuel tank, and while you're in here, also map weapons jettison. The first one is quite self-explanatory. If we take a look at our wings and press the jettison fuel tanks, all fuel tanks get dropped immediately. And as we see here, lights number 1 and lights number 2 turns on. That means that there are no fuel tanks with fuel in them on those pylons. If we want to jettison our weapons, you can do that by the weapons jettison button. For each press 1, press 2, you press or you drop weapons from outer pylon and inwards with each press. Please note that you cannot drop pods. You cannot drop ECM pods, Mercury or Phantasmagoria. They are excluded from being dropped. So that is the fuel meter, and also as the fuel comes down, more and more lights will turn on until the red one at the bottom will turn on, and that means you have 500 kilograms of fuel left. So now you know how to drop fuel tanks, when to drop them and why to drop them, and also if you want to drop your weapons, either because you're going into air combat or you do not want to carry the empty pylons home due to drag and fuel efficiency. Thank you.